You know how much we love a good political thriller, right? And it seems like Texas is serving up a real nail-biter this election season. We've got our hands on a leaked memo from the Senate Leadership Fund. It's a Republican super PAC, and let me tell you, this thing reads like a playbook of GOP anxieties. We're talking a peek behind the curtain at what's really got them sweating. And it all centers around a certain senator who might be facing a tougher-than-expected battle to hold on to his seat.
It's Ted Cruz, and to be honest, this one's got folks in Washington scratching their heads.
Texas, the Lone Star State. A state that hasn't elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1993 is suddenly looking, well, a little less than certain for the GOP.
And this memo lays it all out. Internal polling has Cruz clinging to a 1-point lead over his Democratic challenger, Colin Allred. Now think about that for a second. 1 point in Texas.
That's got to have the GOP strategists reaching for the antacids.
And it gets even more interesting. A month ago, that lead was 3 points.
So it's not just tight, it's trending in the wrong direction if you're Ted Cruz. So what's going on here? Is this a Cruz-specific issue? Or are we seeing some kind of larger realignment brewing in Texas politics?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And this memo offers some clues. It seems like you've got a confluence of factors at play. First, you can't ignore the fact that Texas has been trending more purple in recent elections. The state's changing demographics are a big part of that, a growing Latino population in particular, and that's changing the electoral calculus.
Right. It's not your grandpa's Texas anymore.
Exactly. And then you've got Cruz himself. He's always been a polarizing figure, even within his own party. Those approval ratings, let's just say they've never been stellar.
So maybe some of those vulnerabilities are finally catching up with him.
That's certainly one way to read it. And here's the real kicker, this memo. It reveals that Cruz is actually trailing, wait for it, Donald Trump, in popularity in Texas.
Now that's saying something.
Right. You don't see an incumbent Republican senator trailing Trump in a state like Texas every day.
It suggests that this isn't just about national political headwinds, or even the usual red versus blue dynamics.
There's something more specific to Cruz going on here. Something about how he's perceived by Texas voters.
So we've got a state in transition, a polarizing incumbent, and now this wild card of Trump's enduring popularity in the mix. It's shaping up to be a fascinating case study in electoral politics. And we're going to break down all the angles right after this break. All right, so we've got this fascinating mix of factors at play in Texas. But let's talk strategy for a moment, this memo. It doesn't just sound the alarm, it gives us a glimpse into how the GOP is hoping to navigate this unexpected challenge. And spoiler alert, it involves a lot of money.
Yeah, campaigns aren't cheap. And this one's shaping up to be a real spending showdown. One of the things that jumps out from the memo is the acknowledgement that Allred is significantly outspending Cruz on TV ads. Now, that's significant for a couple of reasons. First, it tells us that Allred's campaign is flush with cash, likely a combination of strong fundraising and support from Democratic groups who see this as a chance to flip a Senate seat.
Which is not something they get to do every day.
Exactly. And second, it's forcing the GOP to play defense in a state they'd normally consider a safe bet.
Right. They're having to divert resources from other races.
Right.
Potentially putting those contests at risk, all to shore up an incumbent who, on paper, should be a shoo-in.
It really highlights the dilemma for these super PACs. Do they double down on what should be a safe seat? Or risk spreading their resources too thin in a year where Senate control hinges on a handful of races?
And speaking of campaign finance, we can't ignore the elephant, or maybe I should say the podcast in the room. This leaked memo doesn't specifically address it, but there's been a lot of buzz about those FEC complaints against Cruz regarding his podcast.
Right. Those complaints allege that Cruz may have violated campaign finance rules by using his podcast to promote his campaign without proper disclosure.
So essentially using his podcast as a campaign platform without playing by the rules.
That's the gist of it.
And it raises all sorts of interesting questions about the evolving world of political campaigning in the digital age. Podcasts, social media, these platforms have become incredibly influential.
Absolutely. And the rules of engagement are still being figured out.
What's fair game? Where do you draw the line?
And the FEC's decision on this matter could have implications beyond Cruz's campaign. It could set a precedent for how politicians are allowed to leverage these new media platforms, which could have a real impact on future elections.
So we've got this collision of traditional campaign finance concerns with these newer questions about digital campaigning. But let's zoom out for a second and consider what this all means on a national scale. Does a tight race in Texas signal a larger shift in the political landscape?
Well, that's what we're trying to unpack, right?
So this Texas showdown has major implications. We're not just talking about one Senate seat here. Control of the whole chamber is up for grabs. And this memo, even with all the alarm bells about Cruz, still gives the GOP pretty good odds of flipping the Senate.
Yeah, they're feeling cautiously optimistic. But, and this is a big but, they're also bracing for a photo finish. Several other races are way more competitive than anyone expected.
Oh, really? Like which ones?
Well, the memo specifically calls out Nebraska, which isn't usually on anyone's radar as a nail-biter.
Right. Solidly red state.
Exactly. But they've got this really interesting situation, a strong, independent candidate, someone the memo describes as, and I'm quoting here, Bernie Sanders-esque, is giving the GOP incumbent a run for their money.
Wow. A progressive challenger in Nebraska. That's pretty telling.
It speaks to this broader trend, this potential political realignment we've been talking about.
Right. Those old assumptions about red states and blue states, they're getting scrambled.
Exactly.
And it's not just Nebraska. The memo also flags Montana as being surprisingly close, another state that's usually a safe bet for Republicans.
It seems like no one is safe this year.
So what's going on? What's making these traditionally safe states so unpredictable?
It's a perfect storm of factors. You got shifting demographics, the rise of new voting blocs, and this growing disillusionment with the two-party system.
People are fed up with the status quo.
Exactly. Voters are more willing to consider candidates outside the traditional Republican-Democrat binary, and that's shaking things up in ways we haven't seen before.
So you add those factors to the incredibly high stakes of this election, control of the Senate hanging in the balance, and suddenly every race, even in those states that used to be predictable, becomes a battleground.
Absolutely.
So we started with Ted Cruz in Texas, but this deep dive has really painted a much broader picture, a picture of an electorate that's changing, an electorate that's more diverse, more willing to cross party lines, and more engaged than ever.
It's a fascinating time to be following politics.
That's for sure. One thing's clear, this election season is far from over. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. And who knows what surprises are still in store. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, stay curious.